Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Point Blank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday live from East London. Today we're joined by Point Blank instructor and sound design expert Paul Ressel. He's going to be taking a look at Reactor, Native Instruments modular environment. So today we are going to take a deeper look at Native Instruments Reaktor to see what's possible. And remember, if you want to learn more about Reactor and sound design, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. And remember, we are interactive, so get your questions in and we will get to them at the end of the broadcast. Paul, welcome back to Friday
Thanks
Forum
for having me.
How are you doing?
Very good. How are you?
Excellent. I'm good. A bit jet lagged, but go easy on me. So Reactor, I mean, most people probably use the ensembles in Reactor, but don't really go behind the scenes. So what actually happens there? What does it do?
Well, so Reactor is it's a modular software studio, and what that means is it basically gives you all the tools you need to build your own instruments, design your own interfaces, build your own effects, and then obviously use them in sort of audio unit or VST environments.
Right. So you can build things from scratch.
Literally
or edit
from
existing
scratch.
Things as well. Yeah.
That's the other great thing about it. So you have all these ensembles like Monarch and Razor and Rounds, but what it allows you to do, and what most people probably are unaware of, is that you can kind of go into the back end and start hacking these instruments as well. So if you want an extra oscillator, or you want to change the filter type, or you want to add an arpeggiator on a sound that doesn't have one, if you kind of understand the basics of how Reactor is put together, you can go in and you can literally hack these tools.
Yeah.
Which for me is really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's a little bit daunting at first. Is that why people don't usually?
I think so. I think if anyone's ever had a look at the structure view, it can be quite sort of off-putting and maybe a little bit intimidating. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build a subtractive synthesizer using only the macros. And we'll get into sort of the difference between modules and macros. Yeah. I think it can be really, really simple and straightforward.
Yeah, cool. So I guess the main benefit of using Reactor over any other VST or AU is the fact that not only can you edit things and change things that you don't like, but you can just create. If you can come up with an idea, you can pretty much create it.
Absolutely. The thing that really got me into Reactor was for live performance. So the Reactor comes with a couple of live performance tools, like sort of sampler decks, sequences, those kind of things. But what I was looking for was very specific, and Reactor kind of allowed me to basically create something completely from scratch, specifically for the way I wanted to perform my music.
Cool.
That's really its strength, yeah.
Hey, so should we take a look at?
Yeah, so let's have a look. I've got an existing ensemble open here. This is OK Computer. So if we had to look at the Reactor interface, you have three main sections. So you've got the browser section here, which allows you to kind of browse through all the existing ensembles. You've got the sort of different parts of the browser. So you have sort of different levels, like the player window. So the player is kind of where all the sort of standalone synths are. So things like Monarch, Polyplex, Razor. So all these can kind of run as standalone in Reactor players as well.
So they were actually made in Reactor originally?
They were all built in Reactor,
cool.
yeah.
So it's pretty powerful.
It's pretty powerful. I mean, Razor is probably one of my favorite synths.
Yeah.
And that is something that is just, you can kind of go into the back end. You know, it kind of blows my mind every time you can kind of go into the back end and actually see like how it was put together. So in the browser window, you can obviously browse through the different sort of ensembles. You also have snapshots, which is basically Reactor's answer to presets. So it allows you to store, obviously load presets, but you can also store, change your own, modify existing presets, and then resave them. And then a whole lot of sort of panel controls, sort of property windows, which allows you to kind of get into the back end of the individual components. So when we start actually building our own synth, this is going to be really important. the main window here is you have two main views. You have the panel view, and then you have the structure view. So the panel view is what most people are used to seeing, which is the actual panel interface of the synth itself. So you've got all your readouts, all your knob controls, sliders, all that kind of thing happens in the panel view. And then to get into the back end, it's quite simple. You literally just double click on any empty space, and that takes you immediately to the structure view. And what the structure view shows you is the inside. So all the different modules, macros, and of course, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
You just keep double clicking.
You can just keep going. And where you can kind of keep track of what level you're on is this little handy tab at the top here. So this kind of tells you like what level you're currently on. A couple of other things that are worth sort of having a look at. There's a file player. So with Reactor, you can build synthesizers, but you can also build effects. So if you need some kind of loop to play while you're busy testing your effect, you can basically load that into the file player here. And then it's also got a file recorder, which allows you to basically record anything you're creating in Reactor. So I often do this. I'll sort of set up a whole bunch of different ensembles, link them together, hit the record button, and literally just make sounds for a couple of hours. And then you have whatever you set the sort of quality to. You've got a whole bunch of audio material that you can kind of chop up, make loops out of, and sort of work with from there. So it's a bit of like a mad scientist laboratory in that sense as well. All right, should we jump right into it? Okay, so what I'm going to do is just open a new ensemble, and obviously start off with this sort of scary blank screen. And again, what you can do is sort of double click to go between the sort of panel view. Obviously, there's nothing on our panel view because we haven't created anything yet. If we go into our structure view, we see sort of our default instrument there. Now, what we're going to build today is a basic subtractive synthesizer. So subtractive synthesizer needs three main elements. You need an oscillator to generate the tone. You need some kind of filter to shape the tone being generated by the oscillator. And then you need an amp section, which is controlled by an envelope or ADSR. So those are all really, really simple components. And to get the basics going, we can kind of get this down in a couple of minutes. Yeah. So first things first, because we're building a synthesizer, we don't need the in terminals, because we're not going to be passing any sound into it. We're going to be generating the sound in the instrument itself. So first thing you can do is just delete those immediately. Double click to go into the actual instrument panel itself, and we can delete those left and right input ports there.
Yeah. Does that actually help with saving CPU down the line if you get rid of everything you don't need?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it just makes it a lot tidier. And if someone else is opening your ensemble, they can immediately see, okay, this is an instrument. It doesn't have input ports, so it must be generating sound inside. Okay, so what you're left with inside the instrument macro itself is just these two output terminals. What I'd recommend to anyone kind of starting out with this is make sure that the information indicator is on. What this allows you to do is when you mouse over any module or macro, it'll give you a readout of what that is, what it does. Just any little bit of information helps at this stage. Okay, cool. So the way you load modules and macros into Reactor is just by right-clicking and bringing up this menu here. So we're not going to talk about the core macros today, or the core cells. The main ones we're going to deal with are modules and macros. And modules are basically components. So things like a sine wave oscillator will be a module, or a filter type will be a module. Macros are basically templates that are already built. So if you load in an oscillator macro, the difference is it'll already have all the controls built into it on the panel side. Mm-hmm. With modules, you have to manually go in and sort of change that. So to kind of save time today, we're going to deal primarily with macros. Okay. So when you bring down this menu, you'll see the macro tab here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to building blocks, oscillators, and we're going to load in this oscillator here, which is basically has three different types of generators in it. It's got a pulse generator, saw wave, and a triangle wave. Right. So let's load that in. And now you can immediately see if we go back to our panel view, we've immediately got that panel there. So we've got our first oscillator, all the controls are already lined up. So again, this is something you'd have to do by hand if we were working on the module level.
You might want to do it by hand if you wanted to add anything that that particular macro doesn't already
Exactly.
have.
You can go into the macros and you can edit them. So the way you can tell whether something's a macro or module is literally by this icon in the middle of the actual object itself. So if it has this little sort of 3-block icon in the middle, it means it's a macro, and you can double click on it and go inside. And there we can see our pulse wave, our saw wave, and our triangle generators. And if I double click on those, I can't get any deeper because those
that's
are
as deep as it goes
those,
for that macro.
Exactly. Okay, cool. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect the outputs to our left and right outputs here. Now, by default, it's a monophonic oscillator, so it's only going to put out monophonic for the moment, and we'll talk a bit later if we have time into how to sort of get stereo out of that. Okay, so we connect the outputs. Now, what we need is we need information. So you can see the two things that it's waiting for is amp information, and it's waiting for pitch information. So the way Reactor works with MIDI is it splits it up into two programs. So you have pitch control, which is sending the note that you're currently playing on the keyboard, and then it has gate information. And gate information basically sends things like note on, note off, velocity, all that kind of stuff. So obviously both those pieces of information are important to actually get sound out of an oscillator. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with the amplitude side going in. So to do that, we need an envelope. An amp envelope, something that's going to shape the audio as it leaves the oscillator.
Yeah.
So again, go to macros, building blocks, envelopes, and the one I'm going to load is just ADSR-env. So this is just a straightforward envelope. If I go back to my panel, I can see my panel now looks like a bit of a mess. And the thing is, you need to be able to design the panel. Reactor will just throw things on top of other things. It has no idea what it is you want to do with your layout. So you need to basically do that manually. And how you do that is by activating the panel edit button here, which is this little wrench icon. And when that's activated, you can start moving your different macros around. And you can see macros are indicated by having these sort of borders around them. And a little bit later, we'll look into how you can kind of actually get into designing them and sort of changing how they're set up. So even now, you can just select different parts and sort of redesign them. So if I wanted to change the shape of my oscillator, I could just do that. So it can really kind of move things around within that macro. Okay, so let's go back to our instruments. So what I'm going to do, because this is going to be an amp envelope, so I'm going to use this envelope to control audio, right? So the actual volume, the actual audio signal passing through Reactor. So you'll see often in Reactor you have two different outputs. You have the red and the black outputs. The black outputs indicate control for volume signals. So if you're sending inputs and outputs of the actual volume signal itself, you use the black controllers. And the red controllers are event controllers. And they're basically for, it's kind of synonymous with CV controls that you used to get on old modular synthesizers. Yep. So low voltage, basically control messages. Mm-hmm. And you use it to send things like MIDI, pitch information, that kind of stuff. So we're going to take from the black output and we're going to connect it to our amplitude input. And you can see immediately the terminal turns black when you do that. So it knows it's receiving amp information. Okay, so now we need information from our keyboard. We're literally almost ready to kind of hear what this sounds like. So what we're going to do is we need that pitch and gate information. And again, you can load it on the modular level, but at this stage it's much easier just to load it as a macro. So a macro is really designed to kind of deal with this info. Yeah. So again, we go macro, building blocks, pitch and gate, and the one we're going to load is the pitch and gate macro. So you'll see on the panel, there's nothing for the pitch and gate because it's an internal macro. It doesn't have any controls. It's only for sort of internal signal routing and making sure that the keyboard interacts with Reactor. So back in our instrument, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the pitch output. So this is going to send the pitch information, and this is going to go straight to my oscillator, because that's what needs the pitch information. And the gate information, that's sending that note on, note off, and velocity, I'm going to send that to the gate input on my ADSR, because the ADSR is shaping the volume, so it needs to get that information from the keyboard. And we have a working synth. It's literally that simple to get sound out of Reactor. So now if we go back to our panel view, we can start looking at some of the controls and what we have just with this very basic setup with one oscillator. Very important, you need to lock the panel before you start changing parameters. Yeah. If you don't, things are just going to move around, and that it starts getting messy, very messy. Okay, so make sure you take that edit control off to lock the panel. And the first thing I'm going to look at is just the ADSR. So just by sort of changing the attack and release.
And it's already polyphonic.
Yeah.
How do you dictate the amount of voices?
So what you can do is in the panel view here basically gives you information about each panel that you're currently working on. So if you click on the backgrounds, it gives you the main panel. And what this will show you when you're in property view is number of voices.
Okay.
So what you can do is you can set that to 1 if you want a monophonic instrument. Or you can set it to, I think 64, it might even be more than that.
Wow.
By default, it's set to 4 voices. Let's maybe just set ours to 8 for the moment.
Okay.
So you also get quite a nice sort of visual readout as well of the actual envelope, so you can see what it is you're doing visually in terms of changing the attack and release and the decay and all that. You also get, because it's a macro, it's already got built-in things like velocity sensitivity, velocity scaling as well. So you can kind of change the way it deals with that velocity information coming from the gate input. Let's have a quick little squiz at our oscillator. So you've got oscillator main pitch control. So that goes up 3 octaves, down 3 octaves. That, again, is something you can totally change in Reactor. And this is another thing you can do if you don't want to get into the back end where the structure is. You can just hack value controls for the different controls on existing macros. Existing ensembles. So, for example, this pitch control here, when I bring it up in the properties window, you can see it's got a maximum, minimum value there. I can set that maximum value to, let's call it 48. And now, I can go up 4 octaves instead of 3. So you can change any of those values to really make it a lot more sort of usable and a lot more sort of customized, I suppose, is probably the best way to think about it. So let's just set that back to 0. Fine control, so fine tune. It's basically just 50 cents either way. And you can change the waveforms in this little pulse. So you've got a pulse width, and then you control the width of that pulse wave. Saw wave. And a triangle wave. Okay. So fairly basic, straightforward. Let's go back to our instrument view. Okay, cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a filter, because a filter is going to give us a lot more options in terms of creating sound. So again, just right-click, go to Macro, Building Blocks, Filters, and then the one we're going to load in is the 4-pole filter, which has a couple of different modes, like band pass and low pass. Okay, so we load that in. Now, if you think about it logically, you're going to want to filter the sound after it's left the oscillator, right? So if you're thinking about signal flow, it's going to make sense that after the output of the oscillator, we're going to basically want to bring it into our filter, and then our filter becomes our last step on our output chain, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete these connectors to our outputs, take from our output on the oscillator here into the import on our filter, and then send those outputs like that. So what you'll see with the pitch gate here and with the filter, you get these PM terminals, and what these stands for pitch modulation, but what it really means is frequency modulation. So what that allows us to do is, at a later state, if we have time, we can bring in LFOs and we can actually modulate how the cutoff moves on the filter. We can modulate the pitch on our pitch gate. So it's pretty straightforward sort of stuff that you can do with modular synthesis. Another thing we can do with the filter is we can set keyboard tracking. So as I move up and down the keyboard, the filter basically opens accordingly, like it does with most sort of synthesizers anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pitch output from the pitch gate, and I'm going to connect that to the pitch input on the filter. And you can hear it's starting to distort a little bit. That does happen because we haven't really put volume controls in. One thing with reactors, you need to be careful. If you just build stuff, you can literally blow your speakers up. Yeah. Especially when you start playing around with values. Like, sometimes you'll multiply a value instead of just adding a value, and wow, things can get really dangerous. Okay, so let's go have another look at our panel and just make some room. I've unlocked it there, and just make some room for our filter. And then lock it again. And you can kind of see it's quite a basic sort of very responsive filter. You've got things like you can control the amount of keyboard tracking. You can also control the amount of modulation. So when we finally get to the stage of you putting a modulator in there, you can control how powerful that modulator is. Okay, cool. So again, pretty basic what we've got set up so far. Let's knock this up a notch. So nerdy.
So we like to hear it.
Yeah. Let's add another oscillator, because one oscillator is kind of boring. So it'd be nice when you can kind of have two and sort of play around with it. So again, you could just go right-click macro, oscillators, and then basically add an oscillator in that way. But what's easier to do in this particular case is you can duplicate existing macros. So we have this one already connected. If I just click on it and go duplicate, it already gives me my input connection. So immediately I'm saving time. Another way you can do it, the shortcut key is just Command D, and that's going to give you the same result. Okay, so here I am with my second oscillator. If I go again to my panel view, I can see I now have two oscillators set up there. This is really important. Name your oscillators, otherwise you're going to get lost in the panel view. So if you double click on them in the property window here, you can just rename them. So let's call this oscillator 1, and then let's call the second one oscillator 2. So now when I'm in my panel view, I can differentiate between the two. So I know if I'm changing things in the background, I know which one I'm affecting. Okay, so we have a bit of a problem here because we only have one input on our filter, but we have two outputs. So the way sort of Reactor works is you can have any number of connections coming from an output to various sources, to various targets, but you can only have one input going into an input at any time. It's kind of the way a guitar amp works. You can't cram 20 inputs into one input port. So what we need is some kind of mixer that's going to allow us to basically sum signals together and then have a single output. And Reactor has just the thing, which is that amp mixer. So another way you can find macros is you can, in the drop-down menu here, if you go Insert Module, you can literally just type it in. So if I type in amp-mixer, it's the one I'm looking for, and you can see it comes up on the list there. And I'm just going to click on that. And this brings up our amp mixer.
Yeah.
So what we want to do with signal flow is make sure that our amp mixer is between our oscillators and our filters. So our oscillators go into our mixer and then into the filter. So what I'm going to do is disconnect this connection here that's going straight to the filter. And let's just bring these down here so we can see what it is we're doing. So I connect my first oscillator, but now I kind of have the same problem, right? Because I can't, this only has one input. apparently. It's so nerdy, but you can fix this. So how this works is if you take the output and then hold down Command and then mouse over, it automatically creates an input. So,
nice.
and of course you can do this.
You can do it in the properties too, can't you? Set up the amount of inputs.
Yes, you can. I find it's just the safe time doing it this way. So what it's done now, pro tip. So what it's done now is we've created a mixer with 2 inputs, and of course I could have 100 oscillators and I could put them all in the same mixer just by adding, using that. So again, Command to basically add that in. Now I can just, from my output, go into my filter, and you'll see the indicator lights came back on. So that tells you that everything's happy, everything's getting signal, the signal flow is going in the right direction. So, back in our panel.
So that's just 2 triangle oscillators, yeah?
Yes, so I can start changing them. I can change the pitch of one. So you can start getting slightly more interesting sounds. And adding oscillators is as simple as literally just going through that same process again. So if we wanted to add a third, we can just duplicate one of the existing ones, call that oscillator 3, and again, holding Command, just bring that into the mixer. Sort out our panel. My panel design is not fantastic, but we'll get to that. And now I have 3 oscillators. So you can start making some really more complex sounds, basically. So not bad for 50 minutes already. We have something that we can kind of work with. Okay, so the cornerstone of any. How are we doing for time, by the way? Are we good?
5-6 minutes.
Okay, cool. All right. So the cornerstone of any good subtractive synthesizer is modulation. Something that will allow you to basically change signal over time without having to actually physically use automation. So what would be great for this particular setup would be an LFO. So low frequency oscillator to kind of help us get movement into our different oscillators and filters. So again, I'm going to load a macro just because it's going to have everything kind of set up and ready to go. So in the macros, go building blocks, LFOs, etc. I love that because there's only 3 things in the list, but LFO, etc. And we're just going to load the last one on the list, the LFO. And you can see the LFO, again, if you wanted to have a little look inside, you can open it up and you can kind of start sort of picking apart what's happening in there. Just ignore all that for the moment. And the thing I want to modulate first is the cutoff frequency on our filter, so we can get some movement on that. So what I'm going to do is just take my event out here from my LFO and connect it to the frequency modulation input on the filter. It's literally that simple. So let's first just find our LFO. There it is. So you can see it comes with a bunch of different parameters. You can clock sync, so you can lock to Reactor's built-in sequencer, or if you're running this in Logic or Ableton or whatever it might be, it'll lock to the host clock, basically. Manual speed control, different shapes, so you've got different sine waves, sample and hold, brown noise, which sounds quite weird. Also things you can control the phase and the symmetry of the waveform, and you've got wheel control here. Yep. So what wheel control basically is mimicking wheel control on a keyboard. Unfortunately, this keyboard doesn't have wheel control, so we can just use the manual one for now. Okay, so it's not really working yet. The reason for this is because you need to increase the modulation amounts on the actual filter itself.
And you can visually see
it's moving. So let's put it to triangle wave. I mean, this synth on its own is probably really more advanced than things like ES1 in Logic. You can do some amazing things.
What's really great about it is that, if you're into modular synths and you're thinking about getting into modular synths and you're on a budget, you can try out concepts and ideas in Reactor and then buy the relevant rack.
Completely,
modules.
yeah. I had a friend whose life ambition was to basically design things in Reactor and then build them in real life. So using component for component.
Yeah.
The difference is a synth like this, if you're thinking about hardware components, it's probably going to cost you like a ridiculous amount of money. Whereas this just took, sort of 15 minutes to get a sort of basic sound going. Okay, so last little thing inside, and then we'll spend the last couple of minutes just looking at panel design and how you can sort of change the panel. Yeah. So another thing you can do is you can send the output from the LFO to the frequency modulation on the pitch gate. So what this is going to give you is vibrato, basically. So you're getting pitch modulation. So if we go back to our panel view, I'll just take the amount off so we can just minimize what we're hearing on the filter. So now you can hear that pitch modulation, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And you basically control the amount of that with this little wheel function here. So that's basically mimicking, if you had a keyboard with a wheel, it would already be locked into that position. Okay, so fairly powerful little synth we have. Yeah. Let's look at panel design, because this is kind of a bit of a mess at the moment. So how you get into changing the panel.
David Bora has just asked that very question. At the end, when you're finished, can you customize the UI with your own picture and buttons?
Yes, you can.
Yes, David.
Yes, you can. So let's first look at the basics. So just sort of changing colors and that kind of thing. Okay. So what you want to do is when you're in panel view is just make sure you click on any open background point on the panel, and that brings up the main sort of property window for the panel. And you've got a couple of different spaces here. You've got functionality where you change your number of voices. What we're looking at now is the View tab.
Right.
So the View tab is going to give you this little window here, which is going to allow you to change the colors. So what you can do is you click on which part of the synth you want to control or change. So for now, the panel color. Click on that, go to Choose Colors, and it brings up this little color window here. So you've got a number of different ways you can do it. You can do it from a color wheel. You can do it from different RGB sliders, a couple of built-in colors. I like the crayons, but that's just me because I'm a child. And what you can do is you can basically just select the color you want, and then it'll immediately change that to that. And you can change other things like the indicators. So again, just make sure it's highlighted, go choose color. Let's maybe use that nice strawberry color, and you see all the indicators will basically change color.
Can you put JPEGs in the background?
Yes, you can. So
I was thinking of putting a selfie of myself on my weekend project.
So the thing with putting JPEGs and PNGs into the background is you need to make sure that you size them properly.
Okay, because it won't be scaled.
No, it'll default to whatever that JPEG size is. So it takes a little bit of background with something like Photoshop to make sure that you get your interface in the right frame. But just to do it, you can open from File. Let's see if I've got any PNGs in here. I think I saw one. There's one. I don't know what this is. This might be. I'm sure it's fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. Whew. So we load that in. And you'll see it'll basically, it'll resize if it's bigger, but if it's smaller, it'll basically just be in like a top corner. Yeah. And this obviously allows you to do when you unlock the panel, you can basically start moving these out so you can get the whole sort of picture in there. And it's not a bad sort of image for the background. Another way you can kind of make things stand out is if you click on an individual macro, you'll see it's got the little style control here at the bottom. So line frame is sort of the default frame style. What you can also do is you can set it to 3D frame, so the title just kind of stands out a little bit more. Yeah. And you can obviously do that with all of those. And another thing you can do is you can change the style of the individual buttons and sliders. So for example, with our ADSR over here, all the ADSR controls are knobs. What we can do is we can change those to, for example, vertical sliders. So just changing them to vertical sliders, which I quite like for ADSRs because it gives you a bit of a visual representation of what you're doing. So things like on the sort of Novation base station, most ADSRs actually have sort of slider controls. And then of course just make sure you lock your panel, and our apparently Arctic synth is ready to go.
Sounds very Arctic.
Yeah, maybe we need to put a bit of resonance on that.
Cool, and you can actually save your own presets, right?
Yes, you can. So the very last thing is the snapshot window. So when you're editing, it'll bring up the snapshot window here. You've got these 3 buttons at the bottom: append, store, and insert. So the first thing you're going to want to do, if you have a sound you like, so let's just say we want to store that, so we click on store, and it'll automatically put it in the first slot. So let's just call this Arctic Voyage, because it's morning and I've only had 1 cup of coffee. And then anything else we want to add after that, so if we get a different sound going, just call that strange. All you can do is you can click on insert, and it'll basically put it in the next available slot. Okay. And we can call that strange. And now we can jump between our 2 snapshots. And you can just keep adding them.
Nice.
Most important thing, save. So make sure you save it, call it whatever you want to do. That saved ensemble is going to store those snapshots within the file itself.
Nice one. And what's really cool about this is if you were doing live performance, or you can actually just move things around. So if you don't like the ADSR being there on the synth, let's put it over there. And then you could map your controllers based on how it looks on the screen, and save all your presets, get rid of the ones you don't want.
You can also get rid of parameters that you don't want. So, for example, with our ADSR, we have the velocity and scaling controls. Let's say I'm unlikely to use those controls, and I just want to clean up my my GUI a little bit. So what I can do is, when I click on those, go back to my property box here, and you'll see under View there's a little icon for visible, and you can literally just take visibility off, and it'll basically delete them from there. Cool. If you want to get them back, you need to go into the structure, find those controls. So if we had to look back at our instruments, go into our ADSR, and we can see they're still there. So we've got our velocity control here. So if I wanted to, I can just click on it and then just put it back on.
And you can also map those faders and knobs to MIDI.
You can, yes. Cool. We don't have a MIDI knob controller set up here, but it's literally as simple as right-clicking on any of them, clicking the MIDI OSC learn, and then literally just turn the knob, and it'll automatically map to it. Cool,
nice one. So we'll jump to questions because we are running out of time. David Boris just said, it wasn't planned, but now he really cares about Reactor. That's the great thing about Reactor, though. Like we said, a lot of people don't dive into the back end.
No.
And then when they see what's possible, they get really into it. That's what happened to me as well. 15 Signs asking, does Reactor have a special unison module to fatten up saw synths? Probably do it manually.
I don't think so. I think the easiest way to do it is to do it manually. So what you can actually do in the main function window is you can actually set your unison here. So you can just set, it's a parameter that exists above the actual structure view itself. So you can just change your unison maximum minimum voices there, and that's going to give you the same result.
Yeah, cool. Vladislav Kushvid is asking, is it possible to make a wavetable synth in Reactor? I think I've seen other ensembles as wavetable synths, so I guess
you can.
It is possible. It is possible. It's definitely more than half an hour.
Yeah, exactly. We'd be talking about going onto module level, and literally you'd have to build some kind of generator for each of those, and then be able to sort of blend them together. You can definitely do it.
Cool. And we got one more question I saw. Mr. Craven's asking if it's to talk a little about FFT. I know Reactor is kind of like known for its FFT capabilities, but again, it's a massive subject.
We're not going to have time to get into that, unfortunately.
But what you should do, Mr. Craven, is come and take a course at Point Blank where you can learn from Paul, and he'll teach you all about it, right?
Yep.
Excellent. So we are out of time today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I'm going to go home and make my selfie synth. We'll be back next Friday for another Friday Forum Live. So we'll see you then. And make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. Cheers.